This story was recorded almost 70 years ago, in 1955. It was told by Lisa Johansson, a woman who lived in a small town called Vilhelmina in the inlands of Västerbotten in the north of Sweden. This was a woman who knew many things about days past. She knew about traditional crafts, about how to dye wool from plants and how to make the most beautiful works of art from it. She knew folk songs and she knew many stories. One day, in 1955, she was visited by a language researcher who had come from the big city out by the coast. She invited him in, and they sat down by her kitchen table, and he put up his recording device, this real tape recorder, and he opened the lid and he pressed rec.
Ja, det var i Olofsbäck. Det var en fattig familj som började där och gjorde sig en liten stuga ute i Solfensslänten där. Och det var en liten fyrknytt stuga med en sån där grov öppen spis i.
Some of the stories she told were about daily life in the countryside, and some were religious, especially those from her grandmother. But some were about older things, like giants, or ghost reindeers, or that hideous monster, the Häckla wolf, Häckla vargen. But this is the story about Johanna and the Pintel family. The story starts at the foot of Blaikfjället, a flat but long mountain out in the Nordic wilderness, quite close to where Vilhelmina is now. During the 18th and 19th centuries, this area was vibrant. People moved in from all over to colonize this huge land because there was a government decree on tax exemption for the settlers. And two of these settlers were Olof and his wife Katarina. They came to this place by the foot of Blaikfjället and decided that here they will settle, build a cabin, farm the land and carve out their own little part of the world. And it was a good place. There were plenty of grass for the animals, and in the summer the alpine heathlands glowed of golden cloudberry, and in the winter there were lots of game, so they never had to go hungry. They started their family, and within a few years they had 3 children. The youngest was named Johanna. And Johanna, she loved her home. She loved the mountainside covered with pinkish and violet heather, and she loved the valleys filled with fir trees where she could run and hide and play all day. And she deeply loved her family. But every now and then she had this nagging feeling that there could be something more to life. And it was odd, when she had this feeling, she felt as if something was missing, but she also felt as if she was missing something. Like there was something right there in the corner of her eye that she just couldn't wrap her mind around. And then one morning she was sitting at the kitchen table, looking out towards the mountainside. And it was just then, at that moment, that her eyes was dazzled from a reflection. Something was glittering on the side of the mountain. The next day, Johanna was nowhere to be found. This was odd, but she was often out all day exploring the forest or the mountain. But she didn't come home the second day either. And on the third day, the parents started to get really, really worried. Olof, he went looking far and wide, but there was no sign of her anywhere. They started to think about all the things that could have happened to her. What if she met a bear? Or if she was taken by trolls? Or even worse, what if she had been eaten by that horrible giant wolf, Häcklavargen? Katarina had tried to stay calm, but she could not help but to think the unthinkable. What if they never would see Johanna again? But then, as the sun started to fall on the third day, the door to the cabin opened and Johanna walked in. She hung up her backpack and she smiled at them, greeting her mother and father, who ran up to her, and they hugged her, but they also scolded her, of course. But the strange thing was that Johanna didn't seem to realize that she had been gone for 3 whole days. She just looked surprised and said, "But I was just visiting the neighbors." Olof and Katarina looked first at her and then at each other, because this was impossible. They had no neighbors. But Johanna just laughed and pointed out the window. "But old man Pintel's cabin is right there." And they looked out the window, but the only thing they saw was the sun reflecting off a rock on the hillside. Katarina and Olof just assumed that Johanna had a vivid imagination, but whatever fantasy she was enacting, it seemed to make her happy. In the coming weeks, she kept going out, but she would come home every night now, and she would talk about what she was doing over there with the Pintels, as she called them. Mr. Pintel was a nice old man. He was thin and tall, always wearing his hat and long overcoat, and he had the longest beard she had ever seen, and he lived just over there with his wife, Mrs. Pintel, and a whole bunch of children. The children were so funny and playful, and they told the best stories. They would tell her the most fantastical tales about faraway lands and mystical beasts. They often talked about this strange creature, a mix between a cat and an otter, who traveled downstream on a raft with a mysterious wizard, meeting the most peculiar people and having exciting adventures. And the food. The food was the most amazing she had ever tasted. The table was every night overflowing with these delicious specialties that she had never heard about before. It was like those feasts in the old stories about kings and castles. Over time, she said, the Pintels got used to having her around. She even got a special assignment. Every day after supper, old man Pintel and his wife needed to get some rest, but the children were so lively so they couldn't sleep. So he asked Johanna if she could entertain the kids while they lay down on the large flat stone outside the house and took a nap. So she did this. Every day after supper, she played with the Pintel children while the Pintel couple slept on the rock outside. And she enjoyed it immensely. And sometimes, after he had his nap, old man Pintel would take up his strange little lute, and he would play a tune that Johanna thought was both sad and happy at the same time. And then they would all dance together all night. after some time, Katarina and Olof realized that she was not making this up. Her stories were too detailed, and sometimes they could actually smell from her those exotic and fragrant spices from Mrs. Pintel's cooking. They realized that Johanna had been vittertagen, spirited away by the vittras. Vittra is, for those unfamiliar with this term, something similar to what the English call the fairy people. It's what we in the north of Sweden call the other, those who live underground and in the shadows. Vittras are just like us in a way. They are not necessarily good or bad, they are just something different. But to be vittertagen is usually not a good thing. It could make a person lose focus and be apathetic to the real world. But in this case, it didn't seem to be like that. Johanna was, if anything, more alive than before, and whatever used to burden her was gone. So what else could he do than to let her keep meeting the Pintels if that made her happy? And she did, for many years, go to them, but eventually Johanna stopped going to the Pintels. Their kids also got older, and they didn't need a babysitter anymore, and they just faded away somehow. They were still there in the corner of her eye, but it wasn't that nagging insecurity anymore. Rather, they became for Johanna a great calmness, a sense that even out here in the wilderness, they were not alone. But times got worse. The end of the 19th century saw many harsh winters and cold summers in the north of Sweden. The year 1867 is still known as the year of great weakness, or Storsvagåret. And it was pretty bad. People would use bark from pine or fir trees to eke out the wheat, and in the northern regions many families were starving, and even more were dependent on food support from the government to even survive. For a long time, Johanna and her family had been sheltered from all that, but the bad times finally reached even them. After many years of drought and bad growth, they realized that they would have to leave. But where would they go? Well, during this time, thousands of people left for this faraway land over the seas called America. Everyone said America was so amazing, space to live, space to grow. They had heard that the fields in America were so spacious. The crops would grow high in a soil so rich that you didn't even have to put manure on it. So, well, they packed up what they could and they went to the closest market and they sold off most of their belongings. And one morning, in the beginning of March 1888, they stood outside their little house, owning nothing in the world except one backpack each full of clothes and enough money to be able to board the boat over the sea. The little family stood there, outside that house that they had built with their own hands, their gaze directed upwards. Because it was up that mountainside, which used to be basically Johanna's playground and which she had seen from their kitchen window every day, that mountainside was now the start of something else, of an unknown and unknowable adventure. Because it was up that mountainside and along the long plateau of the Black Mountain which they would have to hike to start the journey. At the end of the first day, they arrived at the Norway Travel House in Klimpfjäll. The next morning, they joined up with a group of traders who would help them pass over the mountain. The family rented a horse and sleigh from them, and then they followed the traders in a long caravan to the foot of the mountain range, through the mighty Durren Pass. And after a long sleigh ride, they finally reached the Chocolate cabin. Tomorrow they would pass over the mountain and make their way to Trondheim, where the ship would leave in a few days. Johanna woke up in the middle of the night. She heard an odd, distant crackling sound and she stepped outside. It was louder here, a soft hissing, sputtering from above. She lifted her gaze and she smiled. She had seen the northern lights countless of times, of course, but this was the first time she heard it. The elders had told tales about how the lights would sing on these specially cold and clear nights. They even had an old dialect word for it. They called the northern lights the shimmer of sound, låtarsken. Johanna gazed at it, those green glowing curtains and entangling in spirally shapes. And she realized that this was the last night she would sleep in Sweden for the rest of her life. And she wondered if they had anything like the northern lights in America. She was just about to go back inside when she saw something down in the valley. She could have sworn that she, for just a fraction of a second, saw a dark, rugged, dog-like figure skulk about in the shadows far down there. But now it was gone, and she shrugged and went back inside. They awoke early. And while the men prepared the horses, Johanna overheard them murmur about bad weather and dark clouds on the horizon. But the traders were rugged men who had seen many things during their travels, and they would not let a little snow or poor weather stop them. Off they went over the snowy fields. The traders flew in great pace ahead, and the family followed in their tracks as well as they could. Olof held the reins, and Johanna stood on the sleigh just in front of him, her hands in his, feeling as if she was the one directing the horse as it made its way through the snow. The first hours everything went okay, but later during the day the snowfall became a snowstorm. Suddenly they did not see more than a few meters ahead. The wind howled in the air as they made their way upwards through the snow, spurring the horse on to be able to keep up pace with the traders ahead. And then what could not happen, happened. Somehow they came a little bit off track, and where they thought the road went was actually a large cavity. The horse tumbled down the little hill and was stuck in a pocket of snow. They looked around and on each other, and everyone was okay, but they had lost track of the traders. They were all alone up there, and in the storm they had no idea how to find a road to take them over the mountain. And then Johanna heard it. The howling of the wind sounded somehow closer now, and it sounded very, very much like some sort of creature. But the howl was too grim, too loud and growling to be anything Johanna ever had heard before. Johanna's mother's eyes were dilated as she said slowly, terrified, "That is no ordinary wolf. That is Häckla-vargen." The Häckla wolf, that mythical creature from the northern ice sea which roamed the snowy mountains, was out there, coming nearer and nearer. They all gazed horrified in the direction of the increasingly loud, unnatural growling, and then they saw it, a huge mass of muscles, claws and black raggedy fur, its eyes burning like fire. It was standing just 20 meters away, and then the Häckla wolf started running towards them. The family huddled together, realizing that this could be the last moment on Earth. But then the most strange thing happened. Another sound detached from the howling wind, a loud whistle which became someone whistling a tune. The heckler wolf stopped in his tracks, and Johanna realized that she knew this tune. They saw a thin and tall figure slowly dancing closer and closer through the snowstorm as he whistled on that familiar tune. He had a long overcoat, a high hat, and the longest beard anyone of them had ever seen. Johanna smiled widely now as she recognized her old friend, Mr. Pintle. The wolf was clearly confused as Mr. Pintle made a sort of strange hand gesture at it. The wolf and the Vitra locked eyes, and there was sort of a staring contest until finally the mighty Hekla wolf skulked off, his tail between his legs. Johanna ran up to him and she hugged him, and he said, "What luck that I ran into you today, dear child. I was so saddened that you had left us for good, without as much as a parting gift." He went down on one knee, and he pulled out a beautiful shawl, as white as new-fallen snow, from inside his coat. As he wrapped it around Johanna's shoulders, he said, "I thank you mightily, child, for keeping us company for so many days during your younger years, and especially for watching our little Pintle children while me and Mrs. Pintle had our afternoon rests. This is our gift to you. This shawl will never get worn or dirty, no matter how much you wear it, because it was made from wool from our own cattle, and it has been knitted by Mrs. Pintle herself." And with that, he got up and he danced away. The storm soon calmed completely, and they could find the mountain path again. They would soon make it to Norway and Trondheim, where a large cruiser would take them over the Atlantic Ocean and to America. And this is where the story that Lisa Johansson told that researcher in 1955, that's where this story ends. We don't know much more about what happened to Johanna or her family, but we like to imagine and make up stories of our own. And after this short intermission, Chris will tell you our version of what could have happened to her, to the Hekla wolf, and to the White Shawl.
Skickat henne biljett och allting var ordnat för avfärden över fjällen till Norge och till båten över Atlanten. Men då greps hon av ånger över beslutet att fara. Men innan hon ändå gav sig iväg så skrev hon en visa, en avskedssång som jag ska be hennes systerdöttrar Berta Lie, Hanna Holmgren och Viola Edman sjunga nu. Varsågoda.
Crossing the ocean to America was an adventure the likes of which few people nowadays will ever experience, which is in all probability a good thing, for while the thrill of starting a new life in America welled up in the hearts of our little family like a magic spring of clean, cool water, they nevertheless felt all too keenly the loss of their beautiful mountain home, and they braced themselves against the many and harrowing hardships which are the common lot of all immigrants from Sweden and indeed anywhere. And so it was, in this mixed condition of hope and anticipation, that they arrived at the city of Trondheim. It was in an overcrowded room, in an overcrowded house, on an overcrowded street, that the family waited for 3, 5, 7 days, until finally their ship came in, a monstrosity of steel, into whose belly the little family was fed, along with so many others. Down, down, down into steerage they went with all the other immigrants, ever deeper into the narrow corridors, finally arriving at their cabin, a stuffy compartment so small that even Johanna could not stand up without hitting her head on the bunk above hers, occupied by a stranger. Now, if you had a cozy white shawl, which stayed clean even in the filth and the grime and the soot of travel, a shawl which, when you wrapped it around yourself, was a shield against all that was happening to you, a shawl that, when you wore it, was like all of the best memories of home, you'd probably curl up in it and never take it off, which is exactly what Johanna did. And it was a good thing, too. For knit into every stitch of that shawl was a strong Vitra magic, a magic that protected her from cholera and typhoid which ravaged so many aboard that ship, especially in those tight, crowded quarters below decks. Well, as is so often the case with hardship, there was yet more to be endured. This was because our old friend the Hekla wolf was not in fact gone, but he was on the ship with Johanna and her family. You see, after he was scared off by Old Man Pintle in the mountains above Norway, he had lain low for a few days, but not being one to ever accept defeat, he had become invisible, and quickly resumed shadowing the path of our little family. Such was his determination that before he had even entered the city with them, something he had never done before, and followed them thence aboard the ship, quartering himself amongst the cargo. Well, he quickly learned to love the ship, for to get a good meal he did not even have to do the hard work of gobbling anyone up. He could just lurk, invisible, near an unsuspecting passenger, and the fear inspired by his very presence overwhelmed their senses till they could but sit with their head in their hands. And it was on this awful banquet of dread that he nightly gorged himself, and it left him as full as if he had devoured a delicious haunch of meat. Well, Johanna's shawl, thankfully, protected her from even this, which angered the Hekla wolf greatly, as he did not enjoy being powerless, any more than did anyone else aboard that ship. But so they all were, one way or another. Now, as is often the case with hardship, it eventually lessened, and finally, after the longest week of the little family's life had passed, the ship arrived in New York City, and there, after yet more waiting, they were released from Ellis Island into the land of their future. the little family finally crossed a great ocean of grass as vast as any sea and settled right here in Colorado, not too far from where I am sitting at the present moment. It was the place their children, their children's children, and their children's children's children would all call home. Not long after arrival here, where the plains meet the mountains, Johanna's father, Olof, wrote a letter home to his parents, who were no doubt anxious for tidings of their children, after so long a silence. Well, this letter, you must recall, had to retrace the family's steps halfway across the world, and so would have been old news by the time it arrived. As it happens, I have a copy of this letter here with me today. Let's take a look at least a bit of what this letter has to say.
Älskade mor och far. Hjärtligaste hälsningar från Colorado. Jag hoppas att
Dearest mother and father, greetings from Colorado. I hope you have been well these past months. It pleases me to tell you that the entire family is now enjoying the vigorous health the mountain air provides us. And it's a good thing, too, as the demands of our new life here require every bit of our strength. We are building our home at the foot of the great Rocky Mountains. You know all too well the many labors involved which keep us busy from before dawn to well after the sun has set. How I wish you were here with us. It's so beautiful here that I fear I will be unable to describe it with any justice. There are so many similarities to back home in Wilhelmina, yet enough differences to remind us daily that we are in fact on the other side of this wide world. Joys and trials notwithstanding, we do often miss you and miss home. Just the other day, while at work inside, we heard the call of the cuckoo. The children rushed outside shouting for joy at this sound so familiar to them, and we all stood and listened with tears in our eyes. Later, we found out that it was no cuckoo, just the coo of the dove, of which there are so many here. It may be said of us that at this time we are quite poor, for we have little by way of possessions and less by way of luxury, but it is not so. For with the promise that each new day brings, we are filled with joy, content in our work, happy to share all that we have with each other. We go to sleep at night with peace in our hearts, eagerly anticipating all the fruits of our labors. All of us, that is, except perhaps Johanna. I fear she misses our mountain home in Sweden more than the rest of us, and while she often seems happy, she is at times dreamy and distant, and often neglects her chores, wandering off into the woods, just as she did in Sweden, always wearing that shawl of hers, getting lost and causing us no end of distress. We hope that in time she'll settle in as the rest of us have. That, dear parents, is all I can write for now, as work will not wait. Please send us a letter with news.
Kära föräldrar, detta är allt jag kan skriva nu, för arbetet låter mig icke vila. Snälla skicka oss ett brev med nyheter hemifrån så snart ni kan. Guds frid. With love, Olof.
It probably doesn't take much imagination to guess what little Johanna was doing all those times she wandered off through the prairies and the forests and along the winding streams and up the steep hillsides. She was out looking for the Vitra, of course, or as we might call them in America, fairies, though the name, of course, hardly matters. And find them she did. But we'll hear more about that later. Before long, times began to change, and just as Olof had predicted they would in his letter, farms tamed the wildernesses, and roads carved it into grids. Cars replaced horse-drawn carriages, joining factories and belching out smoke and noise. Short wood buildings soon gave way to tall ones made of brick and steel and glass. Electricity lit up the night, and humans moved in such numbers that the plants and animals and spirits of nature receded away into those small pockets where they were still able to exist. And all of this was well underway by the time Johanna was an old woman, and by the time her great-great-granddaughter Anne was born, the wild frontier world in which lived the 19th century immigrant from Sweden, or any other land, was all but forgotten, swept away by the fast pace of modern life. The rest of our story takes place in the present day, not too many months ago, in the month of April, when Anne was, as she is now, a little girl not much older than her great-great-grandmother, when she met de Vitra back in Vilhelmina. Now back in May, Anne knew nothing of Sweden. She did not speak the language. She did not know the songs, nor had she studied that part of the world in school. She could not even find it on a map. She did not know she descended from someone named Johanna, and knew equally little of her story. And of her many ancestors from other lands, she knew equally little. But all that was about to change, for though any of us might forget the past, or never have known anything about it in the first place, it's always with us in ways we cannot imagine, and has a strong influence on our lives, sometimes good, and sometimes bad. This was especially true of Anne, who had inherited something of Johanna's spirit. You could say, perhaps, that she was cut of the same cloth. She yearned to go out and explore, to traipse through the forests and mountain pastures just as Johanna had. But the only forest she had to explore was comprised of a few scraggly cottonwoods which grew by the drainage ditch which flowed through the green belt adjoining her busy neighborhood, where there are always 100 cars and houses in sight, the dull roar of 1,000 engines to be heard, and the heavy footfalls of people as they pounded the paths on their way to physical fitness. It was never quiet. No, I don't know about you, but if I was a fairy, I would have long since moved far away, to the top of some remote mountain or another, or at very least I would have stayed hidden until the very small hours of the night, sticking even then to only the most secret nooks and crannies as nature might provide. So, the only magical wildernesses Anne had were those of her daydreams. Now, these dreams sometimes soothed her restlessness, like a balm to her soul, and sometimes they only served to increase her dissatisfaction with the world in which she lived. In time, she became quite anxious, all because there was something missing, or perhaps she was missing something she could sense in the cottonwoods, in the smell of the creek, and the sound of the wind in the dry grass. Something so close, but so distant, like music from another room. It pleases me to tell you that Anne's story, of course, gets better, as things do, more often than we might think or even dare to hope. But first, of course, it must get just a little bit worse. And that is because the Hekla wolf, who had come over on the ship way back when, had also followed the family to Colorado, where, always invisible, he found a favorite person he would prey upon in each generation. Until just recently, Anne's mother was his favorite victim. Among other torments, he would lurk outside of her window at night when she was trying to sleep and fill her mind with the worst anxieties that she dare not give voice to during the day. But he found a new favorite in Anne, feeding on her rootless anxiety until the poor girl was so worked up she could not remember what was the original cause. Such was her state of mind that the merest thought of anything scary would send her to pieces. And the wolf was there, gobbling up each and every one. Now, back in the month of April, last April, when winter had not yet fully retreated back into the mountains, and when spring had not yet fully sprung, Anne's mother did her best to keep the family busy. So, in addition to all the homeschooling, the craft projects, the imagining with dolls, and the well-intentioned, but mostly failed attempts to reduce screen time, she enlisted Anne to help with a well-needed spring cleaning. This began with the normal chores, but their efforts soon took mother and daughter to the attic, in which the goal was to roll up their sleeves and sift through the detritus of ages, such as accumulates when objects no longer have use, but yet seem somehow too meaningful to discard. And so it was that from an old trunk excavated by Anne, she found Johanna's white shawl, kept by the family all these long years, untouched by dust or decay. Though a finely knit lace shawl is not exactly the fashion for young girls these days, Anne felt immediately its magical allure. It was so soft, so comforting, so warm. And a feeling of safety eased the bundle of tight nerves beneath her ribs, just like the warm tea the Pintels used to serve to Johanna. She got begrudging permission from her mother to go outside, and off little Anne went like a shot down the steps out the door, straight to the little drainage ditch and the stand of cottonwoods thereby. She took a deep breath of the freshest air she had ever breathed, heavy with the scent of wet earth, and the fresh cold of newly evaporated snow washed over her sun-warmed face, filling her mind with images of budding flowers, which she could almost sense bursting to life under her feet on the ground in which she stood. She danced a little jig to a tune which popped into her head, a tune she had never once heard before, and ran off to her secret spot under the footbridge. If you'll cast your mind back to that April in Colorado, you'll remember that humanity, for the first time since Johanna had arrived here all those years ago, had gone silent. Gone was the hum of the 1,000 engines. Gone was the smoke and the pollution. Gone were the footfalls and carrying voices of the busy people. Nature sprang to life with renewed vigor. Birds sang with all their passion, and the rest of the animals, usually almost as shy as the fairies themselves, all came out to peer down the empty streets, wondering, where have the humans gone? Even the drainage ditch by which Anne sat seemed a crystal river, and the susurrus of the water was an incantation of peace. When she reached her secret spot under the bridge, you can imagine the surprise she felt at finding it occupied. For there, sitting with his feet in the water, tossing rocks idly into the stream, and whistling the very same tune which had popped into Anne's head, was a little boy. He jumped up and stared at her with wide eyes, and called out to his mother, who appeared in a moment, ducking her kerchiefed head under the low bridge, and she too stopped, and stared at Anne, frozen a moment, like a wild animal taken unawares. Anne, suddenly conscious that nobody was wearing a mask, kept her distance and merely said, "Hi." At this, the boy and his mother shared a look of surprise between them, and their posture of unease was quickly replaced by one of curiosity. For you see, these were fairy people, or vitra, as Swedes might call them, and they were well accustomed to being, for the most part, invisible to people like you and me. So the realization that they were, in fact, visible, they became very interested as to who this little girl was, who said hi to them. Anne, for her part, was just as curious, and quickly realized that they were, in fact, no ordinary people. Their clothes looked like something out of one of those long, boring movies her mother watched. But the colors were all wrong, too vibrant. And their skin was a queer shade she had never seen before, like the tall, sun-bleached grass. Their eyes were the color of pines in the snow and very large. The mother seemed to be looking at Anne's shawl. She smiled and said a kindly word Anne did not understand. Anne shrugged, and the mother laughed, a kindly sound like a pebble skittering over thin ice. And she said hi. Anne laughed, and they all joined in, laughing for no reason but for the fun of it. And that's how it was that Anne, always keeping her 6-foot distance, came to spend the afternoon playing with the fidgety fairy boy, throwing rocks into the stream, and laughing at all the funny things he said. And over the course of the day, she met the father, who of course had a long beard and a funny hat, and learned that the fairy family had, just like all the other animals, come down from their mountain home to see what there was to see. Anne lost track of the time, and was surprised when she looked up from the dam she was building, and saw that the sun was setting. That night, after bedtime, when Anne's mother could finally bring herself to investigate the shawl for the inevitable damage, she was surprised to find that it showed not a trace of dirt, or mud, or water, and was as white as the freshly fallen snow. After that, Anne went outside every day to play with the fairy family, always enwrapped in the white shawl, always eager to forget the troubles which still plagued her mind when she lay in bed at night. And over the coming weeks, the fairy mother told her many wondrous things, like how she had known Anne's great-great-grandmother, whose name was Johanna, and how they used to play together just as Anne and the fairy boy did now. She told Anne how she had recognized the white shawl, which Johanna had also worn, and the many magic powers which that shawl possessed. It was one of these magic powers which interested Anne above all others. I bet you can guess which one. It was the power to protect the wearer from any and all forms of disease. Well, after hearing this, Anne totally relaxed around the fairy family and was able to play without self-consciousness. And now, confident in the power of the shawl, Anne insisted that her mother take it with her when she went to the store, or indeed anywhere out of the house. Anne's mother, of course, found this very cute, and when she got to the car, she would discreetly tuck the shawl into her purse. But during these times, when Anne was alone without the shawl, her anxiety would awaken once more. It would bewilder her thoughts with alarming suddenness, especially when the Hikla wolf was skulking about, which he was all the time now, for of late he had been deprived of his meals. Well, one such morning, He was so hungry that he decided not just to make Anne miserable, but to eat her up entirely, just like he used to do in the olden days. He stalked her quietly as she made her way to the footbridge. He would pounce at the very first opportunity. Slowly he gained on her, hackles raised, nostrils flaring, saliva and steam dripping from a mouth that craved the taste of a human being. Anne felt the goosebumps rise on her neck, and the world seemed suddenly impossibly huge and foreboding. The footbridge, just a minute's walk away, may as well have been miles and miles. She broke out into a run. The Hecla wolf was hot on her heels, and she thought she could sense hot breath on her neck. Her stomach lurched even as the world seemed to go topsy-turvy. The wolf howled. A horrible sound which had not been made in over a century. When Anne finally reached the bridge, on the verge of shouting and almost careening into the stream, the fairy family was there waiting for her, and they all looked up in surprise. Straight off, the fairy mother grabbed Anne and put her arms around her shoulders. She peered at something invisible behind where Anne had stood, and she said in a harsh whisper, "Hiclavarian." The father arose, and he blew into a stick he had been whittling. A flute, as it turns out. And a few whistling notes filled the air. And at the sounding of these magic notes, the wolf became visible for the first time since leaving Norway. Anne, confused by all of this, wheeled to look behind her. And what do you think she saw? Well, it was not the vicious, bemuscled, and befanged monster that you might be now imagining. It was, rather, a pathetically skinny, mangy, almost comically disheveled dog. His ribs all showed, and his formerly terrifying visage now just looked plain pitiful. Well, they say you are what you eat, and this poor fellow's diet of suffering alone had just about worn him out and done him in. The fairy father approached the dog, who bristled and looked on the verge of bolting, and with a groan he sat down and looked the dog over, and after a moment he held out his hand. Hicla sniffed it cautiously, then gave it a lick. The fairy father motioned for Anne to come over, and did, and he took her hand and he placed it on Hicla's head, and she giggled and gave him a scratch behind the ears. Poor Hicla. At a kind touch, everything inside of him melted, and not knowing what else to do, he closed his eyes and leaned his full, very filthy frame against Anne. But of course she didn't mind, because the white shawl never gets dirty after all. Well, after that time, the fairy father added Hicla to his menagerie of animal friends, which, as it turns out, included a coyote and a magpie and a prairie dog, all of whom enjoyed pestering the Hicla dog, who grew fit again by chasing them all around and eating the food the fairy father fed to him. And over the coming days, the fairy mother also sang to Anne many songs which Johanna had taught her, songs from the old country in Sweden. And though perhaps these songs had been somewhat changed by time, they still contained the sonorous lilt of the Swedish language and the magic of nostalgia and days and lands known only to those distant of our ancestors. And when Anne heard the Swedish language, she did not understand it, of course, but it stirred something inside of her. She thought perhaps she'd be able to grasp its meaning at any moment. Now, one such song, had she been able to understand it, would have been nothing more than the idle thoughts of a shepherd calling his sheep home from the pasture. Maya, a lamb, is baaing away in the mountains. It's black in the front and white in the back. I think grandmother once owned it. Well, to Anne, these simple words might as well have been a magic spell, conjuring visions of the wild country of the fairies, and it filled her heart with wonder. And then, one day, just as suddenly as they had disappeared, the noises of humanity began their inevitable return, and the fairy family, along with the Hekla dog, once more had to leave for their distant home in the mountains. The day they left, Anne watched them go. Hekla and Coyote carrying packs on their backs, the boy looking over his shoulder at every chance he could get, as they gradually faded to invisibility amongst the tall grass which their skin so resembled. Now that night in her bed, Anne felt no fear, and she fell asleep as soundly as can only a child who is content at heart, and she dreamed a beautiful dream. She was on a snow-covered mountainside, under an endless sky aglow with twinkling stars, and next to her stood a girl her age, a girl with a braid in her hair, and they smiled at each other. Then they looked up at the sky, and together they watched the mesmerizing dance of the northern lights.